Imagine boarding a flight with the peace of mind of knowing you're aboard one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, a name that has symbolized innovation, efficiency, and comfort in the skies for years. But what if I told you that within this masterpiece of modern engineering lies a mechanism that, if activated unnecessarily, could turn this flight into an air tragedy? And worse yet, what if the airline responsible was aware of the risk and decided to cover it up? That's what investigators discovered recently, when a routine inspection revealed something so improbable, so absurd, it seemed straight out of a conspiracy theory movie. The plane was parked, no obvious problem, no warning, until, unexpectedly, the emergency engine, which should only be activated in extreme situations, such as a complete loss of power during flight, began to function on its own. The plane remained motionless on the ground, but, to the systems, it was as if it had fallen from the sky. If you've never heard of it, impact air turbine, keep in mind that this is one of the last lines of defense for a plane in total failure. It automatically deploys to harness the wind and generate enough power to keep essential systems running until landing. Its activation means everything has gone wrong. Yet, here it is, running at full power on a plane that hasn't even taken off. How is this possible? The baffled engineers analyzed the internal systems, and what they discovered was more than a simple technical error. It was reporting a potentially fatal risk. The failure of the central power converter caused the system to believe the plane had lost electrical power. As an instinctive survival response, the plane entered emergency mode. All protocols operated as if it were crashing. What would have happened if this had happened mid-flight, with passengers on board? Imagine this. A plane suddenly activates its emergency system. Communications are cut off. Navigation is disabled. The autopilot is deactivated. The entire plane enters a state of complete isolation, as if fighting for its life. And all for one reason: false signal electronic failure, internal noise interpreted as a distress call. At this point, control could be completely lost, leaving 250 lives to chance or a faulty algorithm. But what made the researchers even more indignant was not the error itself, but the fact that Boeing was aware of the problem. From the very first tests, the company's engineers had recorded similar incidents. They knew the power converter protocols were flawed. They knew the RAT could be activated incorrectly, and yet there had been no recall, no formal communication with the airlines, no software updates, no warning. In this case, silence was cheaper. Solving the problem required time, money, and, above all, an admission of mistakes. And this was unacceptable for a company struggling to maintain its reputation for reliability in the market. So the solution was simple, yet unthinkable. Leave things as they were. Hope nothing would happen. Bet on luck. But luck doesn't have a good reputation in aviation. This is a conscious choice. Hide the risk. This is a revolution, because we're not talking about an aesthetic detail or a matter of practicality. We're talking about a system that, if not activated correctly, can cause complete disorientation, navigation errors, and, in extreme cases, the total loss of the aircraft. During every minute of flight, at every takeoff and landing, this hidden flaw was there, silent, invisible, but ready to manifest itself at the most inopportune moment. The discovery was an immediate shock. Aviation authorities began demanding answers, but what happened next was even more terrifying. As the investigation continued, technicians decided to inspect other areas of the Boeing 787, already suspecting that this might be just the tip of the iceberg. And it was then, after removing the plane's insulation at a test center in Texas, that they discovered even more dangerous evidence. It was no longer electronic. The fault was now at the heart of the plane's structure. The hidden flaw is not in the chip or the software, but in the metal that keeps all passengers alive. But that's a topic for the next part. Because what engineers have discovered behind the cockpit could change everything you think about flight safety. Have you ever boarded a plane, settled in, looked out the window and thought, is there something wrong with this plane? Probably not. Most of us board a plane with almost blind faith in the system that regulates, supervises, and ensures flight safety. We trust that there is a standard, a protocol, a rigorous chain of tests. And to a large extent, this is true. But what happens when the manufacturer itself, Boeing, decides to skip certain steps, ignore warnings, accelerate deliveries? What's left to protect you, your family, and your friends on board? Shortly after the emergency engine restart on the ground, engineers decided to take a closer look at the Boeing 787's design. And that's when they discovered something even more disturbing. Bow bulkhead, also known as the pressure bulkhead, a vital part located behind the cabin, was compromised. If you're unfamiliar with the term, think of it this way. When a plane reaches cruising altitude, around 40,000 feet, the outside air is so thin that a human being can't survive for more than a few seconds. Cabin pressurization is what keeps us alive. And what maintains this pressure at the front of the fuselage is this bulkhead. It's like a wall that separates control from chaos. It can't have any flaws, ever. But when engineers removed the insulation at a test site in Texas, what they found shocked everyone. Rivets were the wrong size, misaligned holes, components that were shorter than they should have been, poorly fitting into the support structure. In some places, signs of corrosion emanated from the interior, like a silent disease no one had seen growing. And this, remember, on the very part that was supposed to keep cabin air from escaping in a matter of seconds. Now imagine this, a tiny crack. At 40,000 feet above sea level, this flaw turns into a ticking time bomb. Just another pressure cycle, a tiny structural vibration, and what looked like a poorly installed rivet becomes a breaking point. In a matter of seconds, the cabin pressure drops. And it doesn't matter how skilled the pilot or how modern the plane is. Passengers lose consciousness within 15 or 20 seconds. There's very little time to react. And when the masks fall, if they fall at all, it could be too late. This risk isn't hypothetical. It's not a simulation. In 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737, lost pressure due to a misidentified leak. The crew lost consciousness. The plane flew on autopilot for over an hour until it crashed into a hill in the Greek countryside. 121 people died. And it's precisely because of tragedies like these that agencies like the FAA have introduced new bulkhead inspection standards. But even if a model like the 787 were to introduce these errors in 2025, what are we really learning? The situation gets worse when we find out that this failure was not an isolated case. Several other planes of the same model, built at the South Carolina plant, a plant that had already been accused of rushed assembly, neglected inspections, and pressure on workers, showed the same symptoms. It was a pattern, a recurring error, as if haste had become a value, as if safety were just another detail to be discussed. And here's the question every passenger asks: if those visible defects have gone unnoticed, or worse, ignored, what about the parts that no one sees? Imagine flying with your kids. Everything seems normal. You smile at them, fasten your seatbelt, serve them juice, and watch cartoons on the screen. But under the floor of the plane, right under your feet, there are hundreds of cables, connectors, and vital electronic system. And in the part that supports the nose, in the pressure bulkhead, there's a small rusty hole hidden beneath layers of insulation. And no one, not the pilot, nor the engineer who performed the final check, saw it, because they couldn't see it. So when the FAA finally stepped in, it wasn't enough to just sit back and watch. The agency required all airlines with Boeing 787 remove all insulation from the front bulkhead. They had to use endoscopic cameras and high-definition industrial photography. They had to detect even the slightest sign of corrosion or misalignment. Inspection was no longer visual. It had become invasive, because the risks were now internal, invisible. But despite this evidence, Boeing's official response was, there was no actual injury caused by this accident. And herein lies one of the great dangers of the modern era: a false sense of security until tragedy strikes. The absence of accidents is not synonymous with safety. It's like driving a car with worn brakes and claiming everything is fine because you haven't had an accident yet. And if you still think this problem is far from your reality, think about how many times you've flown in recent years. On a business trip, to visit family, traveling with a loved one. Imagine that, without knowing it, you could have been on one of those planes, and that the only thing standing between your life and the void was a piece of metal with a rivet that was too small. Change your perspective, right? Some might think, but if it were really that serious, something would have happened by now. But this logic ignores the most terrifying fact of all. These failures aren't isolated events, they're recurring patterns. The bulkhead had already been tested in 2021, when the first alarms appeared. At the time, it was not considered a critical risk. But now, in 2025, the same problem has recurred with greater force, frequency, scope, and depth. This is not a coincidence. It is negligent. It's like a building that cracks after a small earthquake. Instead of reinforcing the structure, the owners apply stucco, paint, and say everything is fine. But with every earthquake, the cracks reappear. And one day, instead of repairing themselves, they cause the building to collapse. Now think about how many people blindly trust this system. How many mothers close their eyes while holding their children's hands during takeoff? How many elderly people smile at their grandchildren as the plane takes off? How many teenagers film the moment with their cell phone? Everyone believes they're safe, that someone, somewhere, has checked every detail. But this story shows us that this does not always happen, that decisions about time, money, and public image take precedence over your safety. That technical voices are silent, that warnings are ignored, inspections are simplified, and repairs are improvised. And this should worry us a lot, because the next flight could be ours. So, if you think more people should see this information, I like this video, share with frequent travelers, and basically, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't ignore what's happening behind the scenes in aviation. With every story we uncover, we raise awareness. And the more people know, the greater the pressure for real change. The most shocking part is yet to come. Because if what you see is already terrifying enough, what was discovered beneath the cockpit floor, where the plane's main electronic components are hidden, could call into question the entire design of the 787. In the next episode, we'll explain how water, humidity, and even leaks in the bathroom. It reached the electronic heart of the plane. And, once again, Boeing knew it and chose not to intervene. See you there. Remember the last time you boarded a plane and noticed that subtle, musty smell emanating from the carpet? You might have thought it was normal, a byproduct of so many consecutive flights. But what if I told you that this small, seemingly innocuous detail could be a harbinger of one of the most dangerous things you could do? The greatest hidden risk on one of the most modern airplanes in the world. We're no longer talking about loose rivets or exposed metal parts. We're simplifying everything. Literally, the metropolitan, where the electronic heart of the Boeing 787 is hidden. The electrical equipment compartment, also known as electronic equipment compartment, or simply one compartment. This compartment is the nerve center of the aircraft. It houses the navigation systems, flight controls, power management, communications, and everything else that keeps the aircraft in flight. The space that must be hermetically sealed from any type of moisture, dirt, and contaminants. But, to the surprise of the engineers, that's not what happened. During a post-flight inspection of the plane, which had been flying over the Pacific Ocean for over 13 hours, one detail caught my attention: damp stains on the cabin carpet. Initially, I thought it was natural condensation, but when the insulation layers were removed, the situation turned out to be completely different. There was a water leak under the floor, passing through the protective barriers and landing right in the electronics bay. Yes, the one that should be more isolated than any other part of the plane. How is this possible? The answer doesn't lie in a single case, nor in a random defect. The water came from leaky sinks, from drinking water tanks poorly sealed, since emergency drainage pipes poorly designed. In some cases, those responsible were simply low-quality O-rings, the famous ones sealing rings, simple, cheap parts. But when they break, fluids leak where they shouldn't. And this raises a disturbing question. How could such a simple detail have gone unnoticed for so long on a billion-dollar plane? The truth is even more disturbing. Leaked internal reports have revealed that Boeing engineers had warned about this risk from the very beginning of the project. However, the company has opted for temporary solutions, sealing here, reinforcing there, increasing the frequency of inspection. Temporary measures, not corrective ones, like putting electrical tape on exposed electrical wires in the rain. You know it won't last, but you do it anyway. And the problem goes beyond water. What this water brings with it is a real nightmare. Bacteria, debris, and microscopic metal particles emitted during aircraft assembly. These particles, when they come into contact with humidity and high-voltage cables, may create fire hazards, interference with electronic signals, short circuits, or worse, total failure of the electronic system during flight. How many times have you heard a pilot say that the system stopped working, or that the plane should have lowered the panel during taxi? What if these failures were just the first signs of something much more serious going on behind the scene? In one documented case, a 787 operated by an Asian airline experienced intermittent flight control system failures during approach. The instruments froze for several seconds, forcing the pilot to take manual control. The official report called it unidentified interference. Now, with these findings, the source is starting to make sense. And what happened to Boeing? What did it do? When questioned, the company stated that it had already implemented redesigned solutions, modified the drainage system, and replaced the components causing the leaks. However, the severity of the accident was such that FAA intervention was necessary. Mandatory notification issued required airlines to inspect the Boeing 787's entire drainage system, particularly the connections near the cockpit and the electronics compartment. But there was a problem. This area, located under the cabin floor, it's extremely difficult to access. Almost no one dismantles it unless there's a serious accident. How many planes are still flying with this silent problem? And this is where the narrative takes a turn. Because the investigators, reopening old cases and reanalyzing ignored events, have begun to uncover repetitive patterns, similar cases on different flights, in different countries, with different airlines. And this raises an alarming question. Aren't all these incidents what we consider isolated variants of the same basic defect? The most impressive thing is that this problem of penetration and risks in the electronic compartment, this is nothing new. This had already been documented in previous reports, but was described as non-critical. After all, according to company logic, there have been no outages associated with this yet. But until when? As a spectator, as a passenger, as a human being, it is impossible not to think. How many invisible risks lurk behind the comfort of chairs and touch screens? How many technical solutions have been relaxed to avoid interrupting delivery time? And how many flights continue to operate with electronic systems compromised by humidity, corrosion, and administrative silence? Meanwhile, each new technical report only confirms what was already feared. The problem is getting worse. That what was thought to be contained is expanding, and this, unfortunately, the solutions adopted so far could be just a remedy for a still open wound. And if you're wondering how a company the size of Boeing could have allowed all this to happen, the answer may no longer be in the hangars, but in the offices. Because now, history is about to change. The next chapter won't just bring new flaws. It will reveal how these shortcomings are connected to something even bigger. How Boeing has changed over the past few decades. From a company run by engineers to a profit machine driven by numbers rather than principle. In the next episode, we will go back in time and understand how Boeing's internal culture slowly disintegrated, and because seemingly technical decisions are actually political, financial, and business-related. We're talking about shadow factories, secretly patched fuselages, and how silence became part of the strategy. But before I continue, I would like to extend an invitation to you. If this content makes you look at the world of aviation with different eyes, like this video now. This helps us reach more people, raise awareness, and promote real change. And if you want to stay up to date on all the new discoveries, subscribe to the channel. We don't just skim the surface. We dig deeper through manual, through eye-catching ads. Because safety, unlike marketing, it can't be invented. See you in the next part. And get ready. Because what follows this is not reflected in official reports. Remember that feeling of déjà vu? That strange sensation of having experienced something indescribable? Well, that's exactly what engineers felt when they observed the same errors, in the same parts, in different aircraft of the same model. It was as if time had stopped, or worse, as if nothing has changed. The first failure occurred in 2021. Bulkhead. The nose of a Boeing 787 has been officially registered. It seemed like a minor issue. Misaligned components, misplaced holes. Boeing's response was immediate and encouraging. We're on alert. The problem is minimal. The plane is safe. But in 2025, after all the warnings, research, and promises, the same mistake recurred, only more serious, more repetitive, and it spread to many more aircraft. And then the problem stopped being technical and became institutional. What's happening at Boeing? Take a quick breath. So far, we've talked about electronic system failures, hidden corrosion, and water infiltration in critical areas. But they all have one thing in common: repetition. The persistence of known flaws, the repetition of ignored risk. The emerging model is no longer technical, it's cultural, and therefore much more difficult to correct. Let's go back in time a little. In the early 2000s, Boeing was still considered an engineering empire. Its planes were considered masterpieces of engineering. But everything began to change after the merger with McDonnell Douglas in 1997. A corporate decision that at first glance seemed harmless. But behind the scenes, engineers have begun to give way to financial managers. What used to be decided on the drawing board is now decided on spreadsheets. You might not notice it from your seat on the plane, but it's reflected in every hastily assembled piece, in every inspection skipped to meet a deadline, in every technical item ignored because it would have delayed the delivery of another aircraft. That's what it's called, shadow factory. The shadow factory. Have you ever heard this term? These factories functioned like ghost shops, secretly created by Boeing to repair defective parts without resorting to recall. It was like taking a car with brake problems to a clandestine repair shop, where they would fix everything and make it look like new again. Except, instead of cars, we're talking about airplane fuselages. Instead of brakes, we're talking about structures that keep hundreds of people alive at 40,000 feet. Boeing announced the closure of its ghost factories in 2024. According to the company, more than 120 gliders have been repaired, and all the problems were solved. But engineers like Sam Selipour, a former company employee, have a different story. Many of these fuselages, he says, were never repaired. The misaligned parts were never disassembled and reassembled. They were forced to fit together under mechanical pressure. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Have you ever tried to assemble a piece of furniture with misaligned screws? Imagine doing it on an airplane. And we're not talking about one or two isolated cases. Tests show that hundreds of aircraft were delivered with some level of assembly deviation. Most of them are still working. At this point, the pattern becomes even more evident. In 2013, the entire global Boeing 787 fleet was completely grounded after 2 planes damaged by fires caused by overheating lithium-ion battery. The problem was so serious that planes had to be grounded worldwide. The company committed to redesigning the auxiliary power system and implementing thermal containment measures. It promised, in the words of its then CEO, that this would be the last accident of its kind. But that's not the case. Between 2020 and 2024, new challenges emerged, this time with a bodywork all its own. Microfractures in the fuselage, uneven separation between sections, defects that, if ignored, could have compromised the plane's structural integrity. Once again, without notifying the public, Boeing quietly sent dozens of planes for repairs. Passengers never learned of it. Many of those flights continued to operate during the investigation. How is this possible? It's simple. Boeing relied on a dangerous argument: None of these failures caused an actual accident, and while this phrase served as a shield, business logic dictated that it wasn't necessary to shut everything down. The issue could be resolved on the fly, but then fear took over. In March 2023, a LATAM Boeing 787 flight from Sydney to Santiago lost more than 20 meters high in a few seconds. Passengers were thrown against the cabin ceiling. Their masks fell off. Plates and tray tables flew off. 3 flight attendants were seriously injured. The strangest thing? The flight control system detected no errors. Further investigations revealed that precise adjustment of engine power based on aircraft and weather conditions caused the autopilot to react incorrectly, resulting in a sharp descent. The plane misinterpreted what was happening. And this raises another disturbing question. To what extent can we trust the intelligence built into the system when it interprets unstable signals as real commands? And it doesn't end there. On a United Airlines domestic flight, the captain's seat jammed during the final descent. It simply jammed. The lead pilot couldn't reach the pitch control. The first officer had to take over. What caused it? A small mechanical component that was not on the required checklist. A detail so small that no one considered it critical. But at the time, it almost jeopardized the safety of everyone on board. Now stop and think. How many of these faults are hidden beneath miles of cables, sheet metal, and autonomous systems? How many small oversights go unnoticed? And, above all, what hasn't been discovered yet? New breath. Statistics show that the Boeing 787 Dreamliner is, technically, one of the safest aircraft in the world. It flies thousands of times a week, successfully transporting millions of people. But aviation isn't just measured by what happened. It's also measured by what it could have happened, and that's what's at stake here. Trust, transparency, and respect for error, which in heaven is non-existent. And if you think you've seen the worst, brace yourself. Because in the next chapter, we will dive into the essence of Boeing's transformation. We'll tell you how, year after year, the pursuit of profit has silently undermined the company's foundations of security. Let's find out. Internal reports are ignored. The engineers were fired, and the system decided to protect its reputation, not its staff. What lies behind the corporate curtain is even more revealing than any screw out of place. If this content distorts your perception of what flying is, I like this video right now. This helps spread this research to more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. The truth is often between the lines, and we read it here. Because your safety isn't a matter of profit. It's a priority. If there's one piece that holds together not just the airplane, but the entire aviation industry, it's not made of titanium or carbon fiber. It can't be scanned with industrial endoscopes or measured with digital micrometers. It's invisible but vital. It's called trust. And that's exactly what happened to the Boeing 787 Dreamliner over the course of more than a decade. The slow, silent destruction of that trust. Hidden electronic failure, compromised structural components, water leaks in critical areas, blackout factories, haste, silence, profit, reputation before truth. It wasn't just a list of accumulated errors, it was conscious choice model, a culture where technical integrity has given way to financial efficiency. But how could this happen? How did the world's largest commercial aircraft manufacturer, responsible for the lives of thousands of people every day, allow all this to become routine? The answer lies within Boeing itself. After merging with McDonnell Douglas in the 1990s, the company underwent a quiet transformation. It went from being run by engineers passionate about aviation to being guided by executives driven by graphs and quarterly reports. The thinking shifted from how can we make it safer to how can we ship it faster? How can we save more? How can we respond to the press without admitting our faults? And so was born the central conflict that permeates everything you've seen so far. A clash between those who build and those who decide, between those who report deficiency and those who order notifications to be silenced, between technical truth and corporate rhetoric. A leaked internal report for 2023 revealed that some complete test cycles have been intentionally omitted on the 787s to ensure on-time delivery Engineers who resisted the pace imposed by corporate management were transferred, ignored, or fired. Some became whistleblowers, brave enough to alert the world to what was happening behind Boeing's aluminum walls and silent. The company's official response, repeated ad nauseum by representatives and in press releases, has always been the same. The identified defects do not pose an immediate threat to flight safety. But now you understand, this is not the only problem. In the defects, and in the mentality that allows them to exist, repeat themselves, and spread. It's comforting to think that "not down yet" means everything's fine, and the world began to react. The FAA, which has been a close technical partner of Boeing for decades, has begun releasing independent inspection orders requiring increasingly comprehensive control. Agencies in Europe and Asia, which were previously free to use manufacturers' data, have begun to assume external auditors to test the integrity of the 787 model. Trust, that invisible element, has been betrayed, and it may not be easy to repair. The consequences were immediate. Boeing's CEO was forced to resign at the end of 2024. The company launched an emergency restructuring plan. Deliveries were delayed, contracts were violated, shares plummeted. Meanwhile, Airbus, its main competitor, quietly made progress, gaining market share with the A350, an aircraft that has so far not caused any structural crisis on a global scale. And now, given all this, perhaps the most important question is no longer what went wrong, but rather, what if nothing changes? Because the 787 still flies. Thousands of people climb aboard every day. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, the elderly, children. People who, like you, like me, believe that what's above their heads was done responsibly, that every rivet, every piece of software, every inch of the fuselage was crafted with respect for human life. What if that weren't the case? What happens if the following error is not localized? Because so far, we've been lucky. None of the failures described here have caused fatal accidents. But we've also had warnings are enough. So next time, you don't have to rely on luck alone. And perhaps this is the most important moment of this video. Luck cannot be a safety protocol. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was presented to the world as a revolution. Lighter, more fuel efficient, and more technologically advanced. And in many ways, it is. But an airplane is more than just a flying machine. It's a contract of trust between a company and a passenger. A contract that has quietly dissolved over time. Therefore, everything we reveal here must have resonance. If you've seen this far, then you understand the gravity of what's happening. And that's why now we need your voice more than ever. Like this video, comment below with your thoughts. If you've flown on a 787, have a story to share, or simply something that changed your mind about aviation, please comment, share it, spread the word, and above all, subscribe to the channel, because this video is just the beginning. We don't accept empty explanations here. We investigate, we expose, we respect those who fly, because flying is an act of trust, and this trust, it must be protected through transparency and truth. Thank you so much for following us this far. Soon we'll tell you more incredible stories hidden behind metal structures, digital systems, and sophisticated narrative. Stories not found in textbooks, but which define the reality you rely on every day when you board a plane. See you on the next flight. Until then, remember, confidence doesn't begin with wings. It begins with the courage to look within.